When empaths heal, the most immediate and misunderstood change is not that they feel less, it's that they are no longer ruled by what they feel. Emotional mastery replaces emotional reactivity, and this shift quietly alters every interaction they enter. Before healing, many empaths live in a constant state of emotional responsiveness. They sense tension before words are spoken, absorb distress that isn't theirs, and react quickly in an effort to restore balance. What looks like kindness is often a nervous system trained to prevent conflict at any cost. Healing interrupts that pattern. Through reflection, self-regulation, and often discomfort, empaths learn to pause. They begin to notice the space between stimulus and response, the moment where choice lives. This is a central insight in emotional intelligence. Emotions carry information, but they do not have to dictate behavior. A healed empath still perceives emotional shifts, but instead of acting immediately, they evaluate. Is this emotion mine to carry? Is responding now helpful or habitual? Is urgency coming from care or from fear? This capacity to pause is where their so-called danger emerges. Emotional reactivity makes people predictable. It allows others, often unconsciously, to pull strings through guilt, anxiety, or emotional appeal. When that reactivity dissolves, leverage disappears. A healed empath does not rush to soothe discomfort that isn't theirs. They do not over-explain to manage others' feelings. They remain present without being pulled off center. Psychologically, this reflects a regulated nervous system. Rather than oscillating between hyper-responsiveness and withdrawal, the healed empath operates from steadiness. They can tolerate emotional intensity without trying to fix it. This alone changes relational dynamics. People accustomed to immediate reassurance or emotional labor may feel unsettled. What they experience as distance is actually self-command. Philosophically, this shift represents a move from emotional obligation to emotional agency. The empath no longer confuses awareness with responsibility. Feeling another's emotion does not mean carrying it, resolving it, or prioritizing it above one's own values. Compassion becomes intentional rather than automatic. And this is where power quietly enters the picture. Not power over others, but power over oneself. The ability to feel deeply without being driven blindly is rare. It signals maturity, not coldness, strength, not withdrawal. The reflection to leave with is this: when you stop reacting and start responding, your emotions no longer control you, and neither can anyone else. As emotional mastery takes hold, another transformation follows almost immediately. Boundaries become clear, stable, and non-negotiable. For empaths, this is often the most disruptive stage of healing, not for them, but for the people around them. Before healing, many empaths confuse compassion with accessibility. They are available at all hours, flexible to the point of self-erasure, and willing to absorb inconvenience, discomfort, or even harm to preserve connection. Healing teaches a different lesson. It reveals that empathy without boundaries is not kindness, it is exposure. When empaths learn to set limits, they are not becoming less caring, they are becoming more precise about where their care belongs. Boundaries define responsibility. They clarify what an empath can offer without abandoning themselves and what others must carry on their own. Psychologically, boundaries function as a form of emotional containment. They prevent the chronic depletion that comes from overgiving and under-receiving. A healed empath no longer explains their limits excessively or apologizes for them. They recognize that clarity does not require justification. This alone can feel threatening to those who relied on ambiguity to maintain access. What makes this shift feel dangerous is that it ends emotional exploitation, often without confrontation. Patterns built on guilt, urgency, or silent expectation simply stop working. The empath does not withdraw dramatically. They just don't comply automatically. They don't rush to rescue. They don't absorb responsibility that was never theirs. And because they remain calm and respectful, there is no conflict to push back against, only a boundary to reckon with. Philosophically, boundaries represent self-respect made visible. They signal that one's inner life has value independent of others' needs or demands. This challenges relational dynamics where worth was measured by usefulness. When an empath stops proving their value through sacrifice, some relationships naturally fall away, not because of rejection, but because the terms have changed. Importantly, healed boundaries are not walls. They are selective openings. Empaths still care deeply, but now that care is sustainable. It is offered by choice, not compulsion. This makes their presence more grounded, not less generous. The reflection to carry forward is this: when you protect your inner limits, you don't lose your compassion. You give it structure strong enough to last. As boundaries solidify and emotional regulation strengthens, healing moves deeper into self-awareness. This is where long-standing patterns begin to dissolve, and where empaths become especially difficult to control. Before healing, many empaths operate on conditioning rather than choice. They sense others' needs quickly and respond automatically, often shaped by early experiences where harmony meant safety and approval meant survival. Healing brings those patterns into consciousness. The empath begins to recognize their own triggers, attachment styles, and emotional reflexes. They see how guilt pulls them into over-responsibility, how fear of abandonment fuels people-pleasing, how conflict avoidance masquerades as kindness. This awareness is not abstract. It is lived. In moments where they once complied without thinking, they now pause and observe the internal pull before deciding how or whether to respond. Psychologically, this marks a shift from unconscious reactivity to conscious agency. When you understand your own emotional mechanics, you are no longer driven by them. You can feel the urge to rescue without acting on it. You can notice anxiety without letting it dictate behavior. This dismantles control at its root, because control depends on predictability. A self-aware empath is no longer predictable in the old ways. This is often unsettling for others. People who relied on emotional leverage, whether intentional or not, find that familiar strategies stop working. The empath does not argue, justify, or escalate. They simply don't take the bait. Their calm becomes disarming. Their clarity becomes final. Philosophically, self-awareness represents a reclaiming of authorship. The empath no longer lives inside roles assigned by family, culture, or past relationships. They begin to choose who they are rather than defaulting to who they were trained to be. This can look like detachment to those who benefited from the old version, but internally it feels like alignment. Importantly, this awareness does not make empaths self-centered. It makes them self-directed. Understanding one's own inner world allows for cleaner, more honest connection with others. There is less projection, less resentment, and fewer unspoken expectations. The quiet power here lies in visibility, seeing oneself clearly and refusing to act blindly. And once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. The reflection to leave with is this: when you understand your own emotional wiring, no one else gets to press your buttons without your consent. As self-awareness sharpens and old conditioning loosens its grip, another shift becomes unmistakable. Moral clarity replaces emotional compliance. This is where healing fundamentally alters how empaths make decisions. Before healing, many empaths say yes not because it aligns with their values, but because it alleviates discomfort, someone else's or their own. Emotional obligation quietly overrides ethical judgment. Healing restores a different internal authority. The empath begins to, from values, rather than from the need to keep the emotional temperature low. They recognize that being kind does not require being compliant, and that harmony achieved through self-silencing is not harmony at all. This clarity changes how they speak, how they refuse, and how they disengage. They can say no without hostility, express truth without aggression, and walk away without drama. Psychologically, this reflects a mature integration of empathy and integrity. The empath no longer mistakes emotional intensity for moral urgency. They understand that just because someone feels strongly does not mean they are right, or that it is their responsibility to accommodate that feeling. This insight alone dismantles many subtle forms of control. Appeals to guilt, urgency, or emotional pressure lose their force when filtered through values rather than reflex. This shift can feel threatening in systems that depend on silence or emotional confusion. Healed empaths do not need to argue or expose wrongdoing loudly. Their refusal to participate is enough. They opt out of dynamics that violate their ethical sense, even when doing so costs them approval or belonging. What others experience as detachment is, in fact, alignment. Philosophically, moral clarity is a return to coherence. It is the refusal to fracture oneself for the sake of comfort. The empath begins to live in a way that feels internally consistent, even when externally inconvenient. This consistency brings a quiet strength. It reduces inner conflict and replaces chronic guilt with grounded confidence. Importantly, this clarity does not harden the empath. Compassion remains, but it is no longer blind. Care is extended with discernment. Responsibility is asked, humid where it belongs. And because this stance is calm rather than confrontational, it is difficult to manipulate or challenge. The deeper danger here is not rebellion, it is integrity. When someone acts from values instead of emotional pressure, they cannot be easily steered, shamed, or coerced. The reflection to leave with is this: when your choices are guided by what is right rather than what is comfortable, you become quietly unstoppable. As moral clarity settles in, empathy itself begins to change form. It doesn't disappear and it doesn't soften, it becomes precise. Healing transforms empathy from a reflex into a skill. The empath no longer confuses understanding with obligation or compassion with self-erasure. Instead, empathy becomes integrated with clear thinking, and that integration is what gives it power. Before healing, empathy often operates without filters. Empaths feel what others feel and respond immediately, assuming that relief is the same as help. But healing introduces cognition into the process. The empath starts to ask different questions. What is actually needed here? What is mine to carry? And what belongs to someone else? Will intervening support growth or prevent it? These questions slow the response, but they deepen its impact. Psychologically, this marks the shift from emotional contagion to emotional intelligence. The empath can sit with another person's discomfort without absorbing it. They can validate feelings without validating harmful behavior. They can offer understanding without taking responsibility for outcomes they do not control. This makes their empathy less draining and far more effective. This change often surprises people. Those accustomed to the empath's immediate emotional labor may interpret this new restraint as coldness or distance. In reality, it is discernment. The healed empath has learned that unregulated empathy can reinforce dependency, avoidance, or even manipulation. Strategic empathy, by contrast, supports autonomy and accountability. Philosophically, this integration restores balance between heart and mind. It challenges the belief that care must be impulsive to be genuine. Instead, it suggests that the most ethical form of empathy is one that considers long-term impact, not just immediate relief. The empath becomes capable of choosing the response that is most honest, not just most soothing. This is where their presence becomes quietly formidable. They see through emotional narratives without dismissing emotional reality. They recognize when pain is being used to control a situation and when it is a genuine call for connection. Because they understand both emotion and behavior, they are difficult to deceive and impossible to rush. Importantly, this does not make them less human. It makes them more grounded. Their empathy becomes sustainable. It no longer costs them their clarity, their energy, or their sense of self. And because it is not fueled by fear or guilt, it carries a calm, authority that others instinctively respect. The reflection to leave with is this: When empathy is guided by understanding, it stops draining you and starts shaping the world more wisely. As empathy becomes integrated and boundaries hold steady, the final transformation completes the picture. Inner security replaces the need for external validation. This is often the most unsettling change for others because it removes the last point of leverage. A healed empath no longer looks outward to determine their worth, their direction, or their emotional footing. They have an internal reference point, and it is stable. Before healing, many empaths unconsciously measure themselves through feedback. Approval feels like safety. Disapproval feels like threat. This makes them highly responsive to praise, criticism, and subtle shifts in others' moods. Healing interrupts this loop. Through self-awareness and repeated boundary setting, the empath learns that emotional stability does not depend on being liked, needed, or understood. It depends on alignment with self. Psychologically, this reflects a secure sense of identity. The empath's nervous system no longer scans constantly for signs of acceptance or rejection. They can tolerate misunderstanding without rushing to correct it. They can disappoint others without collapsing into guilt. This steadiness changes how they move through the world. They speak more simply. They explain less. They don't perform their goodness. This is where the idea of being dangerous reaches its conclusion. People who are internally anchored cannot be negotiated with emotionally. Flattery loses its grip. Guilt loses its force. With nothing to prove, the empath becomes free to act based on values rather than reaction. This freedom is quiet, but it is profound. Philosophically, inner security represents self-trust realized. It is the decision to stand on one's own perception rather than outsource reality to the room. This does not create isolation, it creates authenticity. Relationships that remain are chosen, not clung to. Approval becomes optional, not essential. Importantly, this inner grounding does not harden the empath. It softens them in a different way. Without the fear of losing approval, they can be more honest, more direct, and more present. Their compassion is no longer entangled with self-worth. It is clean. And this is why healed empaths feel so different to be around. They are calm without being passive, kind without being pliable, open without being dependent. Their presence is self-contained, and that containment creates respect. The reflection to leave with is this: when your sense of worth comes from within, no one else gets to decide who you are or how you live.